respect to traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Galinga people of the Euro nations, as we share our knowledge, teaching and learning, and also research practices within this university, the university that we're staying on today. We also pay respect to knowledge embedded forever within the original custodianship of the country. And it's my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce this year Lancaster Lecture speakers, a brand new president of the New South Wales branch, Cara Grayson. Cara received a joint PhD program in 2016 from the University of Paris-Dauphine from France and also the Sapienza University of Rome, Italy, working on Bayesian analysis for mixture models and copular models. She then joined the Nuffield Department of Medicine and the Big Data Institutes of the University of Oxford to work on an international project trying to investigate mechanism of drugs resistant developed by tuberculosis. And before joining the School of Mathematics and Statistics at the University of Sydney, Cara was the senior lecturer in statistics at the University of New South Wales. And tonight, Cara gives us a tour on a mixing path from theory to application. And please tell me, put your hands together and welcome Cara to give the Lancaster lectures.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me, also from online. This is my very first talk in person. Can you hear me online?
Yes, all good.
Thank you. So as I said, this is my very first in-person talk since the start of the pandemic, so I'm pretty nervous. Before starting, I would like to take a moment to thank Thomas, because we had the IGM for those of you who were not here, and he thanks everyone. But I would like really to thank Thomas because he was a great president and I learned everything from him. So if I can be slightly as good as him, it's just thanks to him. But let's start with what I would like to present today. So I've been working on mixture models since my PhD, but more specifically on clustering in the last 4 years. Okay, so, and I'm going to talk a bit about this. I'll try to, so I am both a methodological and an applied statistician, so I've tried to give the same type of focus on this talk. And clustering is definitely a problem that is extremely applied because it has many applied consequences. So it's what in machine learning usually is called unsupervised learning. And the idea is to detect some patterns on data. And this can be really different types of problems. For example, like in customer description, you have some cluster or some groups of customers. It can be applied on pollution to have some spatial structure on pollutant. I've applied that on animal behaviors, trying to like where each behavior is a particular cluster or there are clusters of behaviors. There are a huge application in genomics. And more recently, it has been applied also in imaging, and I'll make an example of that. And there is a huge literature. So usually it's a very initial analysis that is common to many other analyses, because as I said, you try to find some structure in the data, and then you may use that clustering for future analysis. But it's pretty difficult. And when I was preparing this talk, already I found some difficulties in finding groups of clustering algorithms, because the main problem is that you can define groups in different ways. And so it's difficult to define what is the best clustering, because it's always the answer to a specific question that is specific to the problem. But I've tried to split clustering algorithms in some way. and I split them into partitioning algorithms and hierarchical algorithms. So the hierarchical algorithms are like hierarchical clustering. So you build a tree, and then you compute distances among observations, and you decided to split this tree somewhere. But partitioning algorithms try to allocate each observation to a particular cluster. And I'm going to focus on these methods, and in particular mixture models. So as I said, I make a couple of examples to show what is the importance of clustering. So I worked slightly on image segmentation, which is a huge brand right now. Used, for example, in applications like automatic cars. So you try to understand what a camera is seeing and recording as an image. And so you can understand that like each of these segments is a particular cluster. Similarly, it's extremely used in genomics, as I said, because you try, the first analysis is really to cluster number of cells, or it could be genes, or it could be several other things, or bacterium or whatever. And then given those clusters, you try to relate the clusters to specific biological mechanisms. So it's usually a first type of analysis. So the basic, the very basic version of a clustering algorithm is the k-means. But it's a good example to introduce the problem because it gives you the idea of what you're trying to do. So you have some data and you start from some centers, and then you assign data points to the closest centers. Then you recompute centers, and then you recompute allocations. You reassign the data, and then you continue until there is no change. So you are trying to partition the sample space into areas and assign each of those areas to a particular part of the partition. However, as I said before, it's not so easy to understand how to fix this partition. And a method like k-means or other deterministic algorithms are more difficult, are less flexible than other methods because they are just based on distances. They may be very depending on the distance that you choose. So it may be more complicated to interpret the cluster that you have in the end. So for example, this is an example that I got with a student of mine who is trying to cluster some tissues depending on their on activity in our RNA splicing, so in genomics. So looking at their genomics. And then you're creating these clusters, but actually it depends a lot on what you're looking at. So if you look at these observations, you wouldn't naturally cluster them in these three ways because the information that these clusters have is quite overlapping. So it doesn't naturally seem a cluster, but it depends on what type of distance or what type of centroids you use. So instead of using a deterministic algorithm, you can use a probabilistic algorithm. And one of the main ones used in statistics is based on mixture models. So mixture is a convex combination of densities. And so you have some constraints on the weights, and F can be any type of probability distribution. These are not only models used for clustering, but they're also used for density estimation, because with this type of models, you can have very flexible and you can represent very difficult type of, very complex type of data, very kurtotic, asymmetric. So they don't have necessarily be used for clustering, but they can be used for clustering. And the idea is that you have like K is the number of clusters, capital K here. And so you allocate each observation to each of the particular clusters. And the key point of this is that the allocation is probabilistic. So in particular, for those observation at the boundary between two clusters, you may have a probability associated to the allocation of each particular cluster. So, and this is informative in deciding to which cluster to assign it. So the second question to ask is why Bayesian? So I'm originally a Bayesian. I'm not only a Bayesian, but I tend to be Bayesian. Once I went to a conference and someone had the same question. So why a Bayesian analysis? And the answer was, why not? So I'm trying to do something better than that. But every time I think, why Bayesian, I have that answer in mind. So I'm trying to not do it. So the idea of a Bayesian model is that so a Bayesian model involves some conditional probability, and it's based on the Bayesian theorem for events. So it's a generalization of the Bayesian theorem for parameters instead of events. So I included this example because I was wondering for a lot of time what was the answer to this question. So I decided to put it in this talk and to force me to check it. So I was trying to compute the probability of having COVID when you have a rapid antigen test negative. So I went to look for the data of this. But the idea of the Bayesian theorem, just as an example of that, I'm sure you know it, is that you are like looking at what you observe, that is a negative test. You try to understand what is the probability to have COVID since your test is negative. So I want to check, and actually this probability is pretty low, and I was pretty surprised about that. It's true that the sensitivity is low, but like official New South Wales data were very optimistic on the specificity. And the fact is that the sensitivity was split between asymptomatic and asymptomatic, but the specificity was given just like as a single number. So I presume that it's not a true number for asymptomatic. Because I don't think it's so, like the probability to have COVID if your rat test is negative is so low. But anyway, this is based on true data. And yesterday I checked that there were around 75,000 tests. So it means that there could be a few hundreds negative tests that are actually positive in COVID. But anyway, so this is just to give an example of Bayes' theorem. But like Bayesian statistics is more based on the use of the Bayes' theorem on parameters. So you consider the parameter as unknown, and so you can define a probability distribution on it, which represents your prior knowledge, and it's called prior distribution. And you combine that with the model on the data to obtain the posterior distribution of the parameters that absorbs all the information about it after the experiment. So I'm saying this because in a clustering problem, you can actually give a probability to all the parts of a mixture model. That means all the parameters, but also the partition itself. So if I define n as a set of indices, then a partition is a vector where of non-empty and mutually exclusive subset. I don't know if you can see it. And then you have a set of all the partitions. Now this set increases with n. So the dimension of this set, the size of the set, increases with n. And it means that, and like it is defined as the Bell number. So it's a number which increases exponentially or even more than exponentially. So it means that if you have 5 observations, you have 52 ways to allocate them. If you have 100, you have this number of ways to allocate them. So it's a space that is extremely difficult. It can be conceptually defined in a probabilistic way. So you can assign a probability to each of the possible partitions, but then it's extremely difficult to estimate the partition because the size of the space is extremely large. We often also represent a partition in terms of label membership. So I'll switch from one notation to the other in the talk, so this is C1, Cn are just labels. So Ci is equal to I if I is in the set Sj. Sorry, Ci is equal to J. There should be a J. So the key point is that if you use a Bayesian approach, you can actually put a probability on these allocations as well. And this is the big advantage of using a Bayesian approach in this setting. So, and actually what it's available in the literature is what is called a random partition model, which is a probability distribution over the set of all the possible partitions. The main approach to define a probability on the partition is actually by inducing it from a model. So you define a model on the observations and you define a model on the parameters, and this induces a prior also on the partitions, which is what we do with mixture models. So you may have observation defined according to this model, and then you put a prior on the parameters that can be known or can be unknown, and you can actually put another prior on this prior, which is what is usually called a discrete random probability measure. It's essential that it's discrete because in that way, the parameters for each observation may have ties, and so you may have that several observations are associated with the same parameter, and this means that all those observations are part of the same cluster. So you create a cluster by inducing a discrete measure on the parameters of the model. So for example, in a mixture model, you have some a discrete measure that creates some ties, and then it means that the observations may be allocated to the distribution characterized by those parameters. Now, the mixture, depending on how I define this discrete random measure, the mixture can be with infinite components or with a finite number of components. And there is a difference in this. I think I already said that. There is a difference in this, and in particular, there are some, I'll go back. So there are some works showing that actually, if you use an infinite number of components, there may be problems of inconsistency in estimating the number of clusters and the number of components. So I'll focus mostly on finite mixture models in this talk, which may be better in estimating the number of clusters, but not necessarily. So if you define a prior on the number of clusters, I overuse some notation. So I consider K both at the number of components and the number of clusters, but they don't necessarily, they're not necessarily the same, but like I assume that they are the same. So if you put a prior on the number of clusters, then you have a finite mixture model, and then you have to define a prior on K, a prior on theta, and a prior on the weights P. Usually the prior on the weights is defined as a Dirichlet prior, but there can be other types of prior. And it has been proved, it's not the very first time that it was proved, but like they are one of the major results is by Miller and Harrison in 2019. What is the induced prior distribution on the partitions if you use this type of hierarchical model. So you can see that if you use this prior, so this model, this is a hierarchical model here, the induced prior on the partitions depends on the prior distribution on the number of clusters, which is this pk, but also on the parameters of the Dirichlet prior on the weights. So I'm going to talk about both to understand if we can do something on the prior for gamma or the prior on the weights or on the prior for the number of clusters to have a consistent estimation of the number of clusters. As I said, something that you would like to do is to reduce the number of assumptions you do on these priors, because in particular, if you have a large number of observations and you don't have prior information on how to allocate them, you don't want to introduce too much information when you are allocating them. So you would like to work in an area that is usually called objective bias, where you define some default prior distributions to reduce the number of assumptions. However, it's been proved that it's a tricky thing to do, because if you use, so most of these objective priors are actually improper. That means that they don't integrate to one. So if you do that in the case of mixture models, you may have posterior distribution which are improper themselves. So you can't use them for inference. There are some proposals in the literature. Most of them are based on a mixture of, or a combination of proper and improper priors. But what I want to say is that this is an area where you don't want to make too many assumptions. So you want to find a way to reduce the number of assumptions, but still have posterior distribution which are proper. I'm going to talk during the rest of the talk of an example in a specific data set, not really because I work in this area, but this is a data set. This is a sort of a benchmark in mixture literature. And it's pretty funny because, so the initial question was an astrophysics question. Initially, there was the idea that a galaxy consisted of two stellar populations. And at one point, someone started to ask if there were actually three stellar populations. And they collected a data set that then became a benchmark for mixture models literature, even if they, probably authors started to lose the initial question. But of course, this can be applied in many other situations. So as I said before, genomics, networks, etc. So this is the aspect of the data set. So it's not a standard distribution for sure, but it's unclear how many clusters are there, just looking at this histogram. And in particular, there are 82, I think, observations of galaxy velocities. So there could be a cluster here, a cluster here, a cluster here, and a cluster here, but it's not really clear because the number of observations is still limited. The fact is that, as I said, it became extremely popular in mixture literature. I went today to check how many articles were mentioning it, and there were like 23,000 articles, more or less. And another point is that the number of clusters that has been estimated in the literature is between 2 and 15. And if you think about the initial question, if there are 2 or 3, estimating that with 15 clusters seems a bit not correct, unless someone is seeing something that no astrophysicist has seen before. So this is also to take into consideration that the question is important in the analysis. So the first approach that I'm proposing to face this problem is to fix a number k. So to fix the number of cluster to a large value. So you don't consider that unknown. You don't put a prior on that, but you try to have to make inference. So you fix k to be a large value, and then you would like to identify the number of clusters in a way that the priors are actually equal to 0 for all the non-meaningful components that you have created at the beginning. So you want to identify a correct number of cluster, small k, which is smaller than big K, which is the number of clusters that you fix a priori. So the idea with respect to the previous formula here is that you play on the prior for the weights because the prior on K is fixed, since K is fixed. There is some work, in particular by Rousseau and Mengersen, who studied the asymptotic behavior of the posterior distribution in this case. And this is the case which is usually called overfitted mixtures. So one possibility is to use a Dirichlet prior on the weights, but then you have to fix the parameters of that. And what you don't want to do is to have an effect or an impact on the posterior distribution on the weights because you have chosen the weights in a way that is not appropriate, sorry. A possibility is to use a Fisher information, the Jeffreys prior, which is based on the Fisher information matrix instead. The idea of this prior is that the information about the parameter is derived on its influence on the model. So it depends on the information associated with that parameter, with the specific model. So, for example, in a mixture model, if I consider two different components, one is normal and the other one is T, the second one will be less informative than normal. So the student T will be less informative than the normal in terms of Fisher information. And this means that automatically this type of prior will put more mass on the weight associated with the normal distribution than the T, because it's the more informative prior. Sorry, it's the more informative model. And as the T distribution becomes closer and closer to a normal, so as the number of degrees of freedom increases, then the prior will be more and more symmetric. Another point is that the Jeffreys prior for the weights of a mixture model has this type of U shape. And this is good because this helps in understanding if the component is meaningful or not. So once the data arrives, the posterior distribution will more easily concentrate around 0 or around a value which is different from 0 when using this type of prior. So if you have an overfitted mixture, usually this type of shape helps in identifying the correct number of clusters. And the key point of the Jeffreys prior in this context is that it's automatic. So you don't have to tune anything or you don't have to choose the parameters. So when using this prior on the Galaxy dataset, you can see that when fixing 10 components, then the posterior distribution on the weights is exactly equal to 0 or is very concentrated around 0 for 4 of the additional clusters, 5, and only 5 weights are different from 0 a posteriori. And this is true for the mean, but also for the intervals. So like in this case, the posterior distribution for these weights are actually very concentrated around 0. So this is the case when playing on the prior for the weights. The other case that I talked about was the playing on the prior for the number of components. So we now suppose that the number of components is unknown, and we put a prior on that. So in this case, you would combine the prior distribution for the number of components with all the other priors. That means the prior on the weights and the prior on the parameters, to derive a joint posterior distribution of all of that. So number of components, weights, and parameters. And you can then derive the marginal posterior distribution on the number of components. So there is something to be said in this context. And one thing to say is that the space in which K lies is the number, the set of natural numbers. So it can be even infinite. This is important to consider because if you, like in the literature, often they truncate the number of possible clusters because it makes things like analytically and computationally easier. But it has an effect. It can modify, or it can attract the posterior distribution towards the larger values. And so like not having, so having this type of constraint may affect inferential results. But there is another problem, that is that the prior on K must be proper, because if it's not proper, the posterior distribution is going to be improper. And so the prior has to be proper, but it also has to be defined on the set of prior of natural numbers. So what actually happens in many models using a prior which is not truncated is that the number of clusters increases, the number of estimated clusters increases. And what happens is that many more clusters tend to be very small. So they can be singleton, or they can have a size that is very small. So this is usually something that when you do clustering, you try to avoid, because these are clusters which has a difficult interpretation. It's unclear when you have such small clusters, it's unclear if they are true clusters or they are just being created because of the inferential algorithm. So this is something that is really seen in the literature. It's good for density estimation if you use mixture models for density estimation, but if you use them for clustering, it's quite a problem. There are several, not so many, but there are a few prior distribution proposed for K. One is, so the main one, or the most, the oldest one is the uniform between 0 and 30. Of course, 30 is a weird number. It's a bit like problem specific, probably define that upper bound. But it's very used because it's used in one of the first papers talking about like a Bayesian analysis of mixture models without fixing K, like one of the most famous. Once I made a presentation, actually it's in uni, and Peter Green was there. And then he told me that he didn't want that prior to be the best prior. So I didn't have to interpret like that, but I didn't. The second one is a Poisson with parameter 1. This is the only prior that has a mathematical interpretation, so a mathematical derivation, before one that we proposed more recently. So like it makes sense because it's defined, is proper, and it's defined in N. Another proposal is the beta negative binomial with some parameters. And like we derived that with, like I did with some co-authors, we derived that with a mathematical interpretation and a mathematical derivation. There were other authors that already proposed that. in particular the group of Silvia Provish-Natter. But like they proposed to use that together with, to combine that prior with prior on the weights, which is called the dynamic, because the weights, so the parameters of the Dirichlet prior on the weights are defined in this way that depends on the number of clusters. So these parameters tends to be smaller and smaller as the number of clusters increases. But which is true, which is good in some way, but they have also some negative characteristics as well. So this is an example of the differences between a static and a dynamic model. So the dynamic model is the one that I just mentioned. So when you associate the prior on the weights to the dimension of, so the size of the clusters. And this is a case where the number of cluster and the number of components may be strongly different. So the blue line is the number of components and the red line is the number of clusters. So you may have a prior which is very different on the clusters, which is the full components and the components. And I'll talk in a bit about what this means in terms of posterior. So what I proposed with my co-authors was actually to define a prior on K, which is based on a loss-based approach, or the decision theoretic approach, where you define a loss associated with any particular choice of the number of components. And this loss may be defining information. So it may have a term relative to the information loss and a term relative to the complexity loss. So it's a very wordy slide, but the main point here is that the quantification of the information loss usually done in terms of Kullback-Leibler. But if you just look at the information loss, you have and where the posterior distribution concentrates, if you remove a possible component, the loss attains its minimum at 0. So it's not extremely informative to define a prior distribution. It's more useful to define a loss function depending on a complexity loss. So that this loss can be linear, for example. So when the number of clusters increases in a mixture model, also the number of parameters increases. And so you define this loss in terms of, so you increase the loss in a linear way depending on the number of clusters that you pick. And if you define this loss, complexity loss in this way, it's nice to see that the prior distribution that you can derive is actually known in closed form as any sub-beta negative binomial. And you can define, so this can be an objective prior or a default prior if you fix all the parameters to 1. Or it can be an informative prior if you fix, if you have prior information and you define these parameters different from 1. So this was a mathematical derivation of a prior that was already used sometimes in the literature. And as I said, it can be, you can put information, you can define information on this prior by playing on the expected value and the variance of the number of clusters if you have information about that. So going back to the Galaxy dataset, this is a comparison of the 3 priors that I showed before. So this is the posterior distribution on the number of clusters using these 3 prior distribution. You can see that when using the uniform prior, which is the green one, the posterior distribution is moved towards values of 6 or 7. and it has a long tail towards 20. When you use a Poisson prior with parameter 1, the prior is very concentrated around, the posterior distribution is very concentrated around 3. And when you use the beta negative binomial prior with the default choice, so by using all parameters equal to 1, you have an intermediate situation between a very conservative prior and a prior which is not, doesn't lead to a consistent estimation. So it's more consistent. It's still 3 is a very likely value, but it has a longer tail. So this is a comparison of, so still for the Galaxy data set, this is a comparison between a static approach, which is the one developed here, and a dynamic approach, which is the one where the prior on the weights changes with the number of clusters. What you can see is that, again, the prior or the number of clusters, sorry, the posterior distribution on the cluster of the Galaxy dataset is very different from the posterior distribution of the number of components. But then if you look at these plots and you look at the previous plots, you see that the posterior distribution is quite similar to the prior distribution. So the question is it moving too much? The posterior distribution, like, given that you can define what too much means. But yeah, but it's quite surprising, and maybe, I mean, it seems to me that it follows too much the prior distribution. It means that if you choose the prior distribution, or if you change the prior distribution on the number of components, you may have very different results in the the posterior distributions as well. So if I want to summarize everything, I would say that clustering is difficult, and estimating the number of clusters in a Bayesian way, but also not in a Bayesian way, is not easy. Part of the problem is that a cluster doesn't have a meaning per se, but has a meaning depending on the problem. So it is possible that, so to define what a cluster means, that means to define how observations are homogeneous, can be problem specific and can have some input from the experimenter. What is clear to me is that prior distributions in this context may have an important role. They may move the posterior distribution sometimes, but you need some prior information to have a meaningful inference on the posterior distribution, because if you don't, you tend to have too many clusters. You tend to estimate too many clusters, and it's easy to go towards inconsistent procedures. On the other hand, this is a setting where you would like to reduce the number of assumptions that you give when you define the model, because you don't want you don't necessarily want your assumptions to move inference too much. I produced results only on the Galaxy dataset, which is an easy dataset, but everything I said is still valid for the multivariate setting. So I think I'll stop here, and I'm available for questions if you have. Thank you very much for listening.
This is for the online audience. So Michael has one question there.
Is this thing on?
Yeah, it's for the online audiences.
Okay, good. Thanks very much, Clara. I always love hearing clear, interesting talks about mixtures. Look, I just had a very irritating technical question. You know, your default prior with the beta negative binomial, and you said if you put the parameters equal to 1, it's a default prior. I was curious about that. How do you sort of argue that that should be a default prior?
Yep. So, I mean, it depends on what you define as a default prior, I guess.
Right.
No, but like the idea behind that. So I went quick on this slide, but the derivation we had is related to, so you define the prior on K in this way.
Mm-hmm.
So you relate that to this parameter C, this hyperparameter C.
Okay.
And so you can put a prior on that as well. So instead of putting that directly on C, we used a prior on a transformation on that was this P.
Okay. Okay.
And we put a beta distribution on that parameter P.
Mm-hmm.
So choosing alpha and beta equal to 1 corresponds to a uniform prior for P.
Right.
So it's default just in that sense, but it doesn't
Okay.
mean that it doesn't bring information.
Right. So, I mean, I was sort of, when I saw that, I thought, this is like, you know, Bayesian estimation of a binomial parameter, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what about the Jeffreys prior? What's that when they're both a half or something?
Here, you can.
You know, I'm just sort of wondering, because is it sort of, is there any other reasoning that would say that e to the minus c should be like a uniform or behave like some sort of binomial like parameter? You know?
Yeah,
what I mean?
you can. So you can incorporate different techniques in this. So if you use a beta prior, then you have a beta negative binomial as prior for K.
Right.
So your choices on P have this effect on the prior for K.
Okay.
If you choose a prior which is not beta, then you can still use it, but like, but it depends. Then you have to prove that the prior on K is proper.
Gotcha. Okay.
So not necessarily every prior on P may lead to a proper prior for K.
Okay.
I guess.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. See whether there's any questions online. If there's any kind of questions online, that we're happy to take any questions. There isn't any at the moment. All right, any other questions from the audience?
Thanks, Clara, for the talk. I think I have a quite maybe naive question. So in your conclusion, you talk about consistently estimating the number of components. So what it means is, like, for example, if you put on the prior on the K like that, you want to see whether, like, for example, the posterior mean or something is kind of like consistent for the true number of cluster. What does it mean by consistently estimating the number of components?
Yeah, this is a very good point because so what happened is that in many situations, one for all the standard Dirichlet process mixture model, the posterior for the number of clusters doesn't concentrate anywhere as n goes to infinity, which is what you observe in practice in what I said in this plot. That what you observe is that as n increases, you have more and more small clusters. When I mean consistently estimate, and there is no result so far about this, as far as I know. I mean, like that the posterior distribution on the number of cluster concentrates somewhere. That ideally is the right location. But so far there is no proof that you can do that. So it's still an open problem as far as I know. But there are results that there are some priors that lead to not consistent estimation. That means that the posterior distribution doesn't concentrate on value and put more and more mass on infinite.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very interesting.